If you make any material modifications to the way your engine ingests air or expels hot exhaust gases, you're likely going to want to get it tuned or perhaps tune it yourself so that you can optimize your fuel and spark for your new parts combination. Let's talk about a list of some common modifications we do to our LS engines, and the list is in order by how important it is, in my opinion, that some tuning work be done after the modification is complete. First up, let's just talk briefly about stock LS engines, and you could even have an aftermarket axle-back exhaust. For the most part, in my opinion, you're really not going to find a lot of horsepower unless you're willing to tune it exclusively for higher octane fuels like 93 and above. And in my case with this LS2, which has a relatively high compression ratio of 10.9 to 1 stock, I found in my testing that I picked up over 20 horsepower running this on 95 octane. Add a cold air intake, and depending on which one you go with, you might pick up a few more horsepower with a tune. If you upgrade your intake manifolds, specifically the LS1 engines are proven to like the LS6 intake manifolds, and LS2 engines very much like the LSXR 102 intake manifolds from Fast. With these, if you go ahead and tune it after the install, you're probably going to pick up a few more horsepower. LS3 guys, you're pretty lucky because your stock LS3 intake manifold is actually pretty good right from the factory. Add a set of aftermarket headers, and with a good tune, you're likely to pick up 25 horsepower, maybe a little bit more. If you go the route of ported cylinder heads or aftermarket cylinder heads and or a camshaft, you absolutely need a tune to unlock all of the power that these modifications will bring. And depending on how radical of a camshaft you go with, you might just need a tune to make it out of your driveway. Now, if your plan is to use a set of aftermarket headers, as long as they have a bung welded into the collector area or into the mid-pipe, your wideband will hook up and you'll be good to go. On the other hand, if you're going to retain your C6's stock exhaust manifolds and catalytic converters, which do flow quite well, this does complicate things a little bit. The stock C6 catalytic converters are mounted directly to the exhaust manifolds, and that makes it nearly impossible to get the full 18 inches of separation between the cylinder head exhaust port and where the wideband sensor element itself is screwed into the exhaust that is required by AEM and most other wideband manufacturers in order to avoid overheating and potentially destroying the wideband sensor element. So the only choice we have on the C6, if retaining the catalytic converters, is to mount the wideband sensor directly after the catalytic converters. The problem is mounting the wideband oxygen sensors directly after the catalytic converters complicates their ability to accurately tune the engine. But fortunately, there is a workaround that still allows us to tune accurately at wide open throttle and part throttle. We'll dig into that in just a second. But first, let's discuss why you may want to retain your stock C6 catalytic converters. And I bring this up because if you do hop on the forums, there's going to be plenty of louder voices that'll say, gut those catalytic converters out or get rid of them altogether. Reason number one, it's illegal. I know this doesn't stop a lot of people from removing them anyway, but I thought I'd bring it up in case you didn't know. Reason number two, for engines that create less than 500 horsepower to the rear tires, modern efficient catalytic converters are only going to cost you somewhere around 5 to 8 horsepower, so that's less than a lot of people think. Reason number three, if you do remove your catalytic converters from your C6, your car will be noticeably more stinky.
What is that smell?
Than it was when you had the catalytic converters. A lot of people out there downplay this situation, but I guarantee you there are more than a few people that regret removing their catalytic converters for this very reason. Reason number four, and this is kind of an indirect reason to perhaps keep your stock exhaust manifolds and catalytic converters. Aftermarket headers are quite expensive, and while it's true they do typically dyno at about 25 plus more horsepower to the rear tires, that's when they're tested under ideal optimal conditions. In everyday normal real-world driving, they're going to give some of that horsepower back because of additional heat soak. Heat soak can and will be caused by headers due to all of those additional extra square inches of exhaust tubing that radiate heat into your relatively enclosed engine bay. Now, most of this heat can be swept away at higher speeds from underneath the car, but during mid-speed driving of 30-40 miles an hour, and for sure during slow-speed driving like stop and go, heat soak is definitely going to build in your engine bay, and its effects are real. Now, someone will likely leave a comment that long tube headers don't really increase underhood heat, And to that I say, doesn't that engine bay look nice and tightly sealed with the hood closed? And take a close look at my shop heater. What do all those tubes remind you of? Lastly, some of the exhaust scavenging that long tube headers excel at, especially if paired with an appropriate camshaft, can be muted if you're forced to use catalytic converters with your long tube headers. Not because the catalytic converters don't flow well, because they do, but they do somewhat dampen the exhaust pulses that the long tube headers create in the collector area, and that's going to kind of negate a little bit of that scavenging effect. Just something to think about if you have to use long tube headers with catalytic converters. Anyway, last fall, right before winter, I removed my complete LS2 air filter assembly, including its stock mass airflow sensor, and I replaced it with a complete LS7 assembly, including its card-style mass airflow sensor. I made this change because the LS7 assembly itself is much freer flowing. It grabs its air much further forward and down low where it's cooler, and the card style mass airflow sensor is much less restrictive than the LS2 style. Last fall I had just enough time to get it running and take a test drive, and then winter set in. Now it's finally spring and it's time to do some tuning to get it dialed in, and that's why it's time to weld in an oxygen sensor bung for my wideband. First, let me confess that I did temporarily try to replace one of the narrow bands in my exhaust manifold with the wideband oxygen sensor, even though the AEM instructions say not to because it's nowhere near the 18 inches of distance. I figured it may not hurt the wideband too much because I was only going to do a couple hours of testing. It worked great for a little part throttle testing, but then it stopped working after exactly one full throttle pull. So there I was back on the computer ready to place an order for a new wideband sensor, and I thought, it's been a little while, let me head back out to the shop and just give it one more try and see if it works, and fortunately it started working again. So I'm pretty sure I overheated it and I don't want to risk destroying my sensor, so here I am underneath the C6. I'm looking for a spot that I can install and replace the wideband sensor anytime I need to do some tuning without busting my knuckles. Alright, I'm under the passenger side here. And unfortunately, as you can see, there's just no room with this catalytic converter being right up against the exhaust manifold. So the same thing goes on the driver's side. You've got the exhaust manifold, and boom, here's the catalytic converter. And on the C5, I've got my widebands kind of in the mid-pipe somewhere in here, and that's worked well for years. And that brings us to the front part here of the mid-pipe, which gives me the access I need to the wideband sensor element, and more importantly, it gives us that 18 inches of distance we need from the cylinder head exhaust port to the wideband sensor. So I'm going to drop the mid-pipe down, and I've already marked this. This gives me plenty of room if I weld a bung in right here. I've got these soaked with a little bit of penetrating fluid. Hopefully we'll drop the mid-pipe down without a problem. A couple bolts back here, they're soaking as well. Let's do it. Luckily all these came off without any broken studs. I'll take it because that's one of those things that can always happen. Back by the rear differential, loosened up both of these band clamps, and I just made a little mark on each side so when I put it back together I know where it was. Pretty close anyway. Thank you to whoever installed this before. They didn't crush the crap out of that. So it really didn't kick and scream too much. Now we have a really good view. So we can bore a hole in here and then do a nice weld. Here's the oxygen sensor bung kit I'm using. It comes with two of them. They're stainless steel, come with copper washers, and got nice little plugs so that when I'm not tuning I can remove the wideband and put the plugs in. I'll be sure to include a link in the description below. Now when this exhaust bung is welded on, it needs to be completely welded around its perimeter, and it can't have any pinholes because any oxygen that gets in there will definitely skew the readings. All right, we've got the bung marked where we want it, and you can see it's even got a bevel to it to follow the contour of the pipe, so that's kind of nice. So we'll just do a center punch, drill the hole, and get this thing ready for welding. Then it's time for the fun part when you can start reinstalling everything you've taken apart. All right, both of these band clamps are cinched back up. You want them tight, but you don't want to crank on them too much. In fact, there's kind of a wedge in here so you can't go overboard and crush these things, which is nice. And then of course retighten the mid hanger. And these at the front here you don't want to over tighten either. Nice and snug. If you're not sure, look up the torque spec. But you can see I could tighten these more, but then I would be bending this clamp. It doesn't need to be that tight. And I've got the wideband installed, safely routed. I've got it zip tied to an existing hole here. Use a little cleaner along the floor here, and then use some Gorilla Tape. I've used it many times in the past and it's never failed. I did drill one little hole so I could zip tie it here. And now I'll run it carefully up the side of the car after I clean it. So here's my wideband setup. I've always just liked to transfer my wideband to the car that I happen to be tuning. That way my HP Tuners is already set up and ready to go with a familiar wideband that I know well and I trust. And if I did everything correctly, all I need to do now is plug in the wideband and start the C6. Success. Now the one that you saw on the gauge is the air-fuel ratio in terms of lambda, which is a video for another day, but just know a lambda value of 1 would essentially just equal a pump gas air-fuel ratio of 14.7 to 1. Now let's just back up 1 second. You saw that I plugged in the wideband sensor and then I started the car. This is important because a lot of guys out there are killing their wideband oxygen sensors, and a replacement is somewhere between $50 and $100, which is kind of expensive. So here's the deal. When you plug in the wideband sensor, it has its own built-in heating element to get it hot. And if you plug it in too early, it's going to get super hot. And then when you start the car, if there's any condensation from the combustion process that was kind of left over, and it's cold, and it hits that hot sensor, it likely is going to kill your wideband oxygen sensor. So I like to plug in my wideband and then start the car. That way, if any moisture does hit it, they're about the same temperature so it doesn't suffer thermal shock, which is what destroys the sensor. And I've been fortunate enough and lucky enough to have my same wideband for a little over 8 years now, and I probably shouldn't have just brought that up. Moving on, like I said earlier, there is a drawback to mounting the wideband oxygen sensor after the catalytic converter, and that is it's just not accurate for part throttle tuning. At part throttle, closed loop, that catalytic converter is affecting that air-fuel ratio just too much. So in my opinion, a better plan is to do all of the part throttle tuning in this situation based upon the short-term plus the long-term fuel trims. And for wide open throttle tuning with my wideband mounted just a little ways after my catalytic converter, all I really do is hit wide open throttle about 1,000 RPMs sooner than I normally would. And that allows about another full second for that extra volume of rich mixture exhaust gas to essentially overrun the catalytic converter to the point at which it doesn't materially affect the air-fuel ratio that the wideband is going to see. Now through the years, the subject of mounting your wideband right after the catalytic converter has been the subject of a lot of debate. I have done considerable research on this subject, and I am convinced that if you follow the procedure that I just laid out, this will be more than accurate enough for all but the absolute highest horsepower cars. In worst case scenario, I believe the actual air-fuel ratio you might end up with in your tune at wide open throttle would at most be 1% richer than what you're actually seeing on the gauge, and that number is essentially irrelevant. Here's some real-world data from an actual dyno run that shows the pre and the post-CAT wideband oxygen sensor values, and as you can see, after the short delay, the values end up being essentially identical. Now that I've got the wideband all set up and ready to go in the C6, it's time for me to get busy tuning for that LS7 complete air intake assembly, including the mass airflow sensor that I put in last fall. And if everything goes right with the tuning, I hope to get the C6 out to the drag strip in the next few days. There will probably be a video on that. And that way we'll get some good solid baseline numbers, and we'll know for sure if future modifications are actually helping the horsepower situation or not. Guys, if you learned anything from this video, go ahead and tap that thumbs up below so that YouTube knows about it. Be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the future video, which could be drag racing. But most of all, thanks for watching.